Hello guys, my name is Piros Katsios and this is part 2 of taking server validation and display the errors like the built-in validation that exists in Blazor. Okay, in part 1 we did that with simple objects. Now we're going to do that with complex object, that object that they have child objects. Let's go and see what do I have. Here I have a new command, a create house command, which takes an address, a first name, a last name, and an age. That the first name, last age, and age represent the buyer's first name or the owner's first name, last name, and age. But I use the same name for all the properties, so we don't have to waste our time with mapping, etc. Anyway, we have our handler for that command that does, as the previous one, nothing. And then we have our validator, which validates the age, the first name and the last name as the previous validator for the create person, and also validate that the address is not empty. We have our create house VM, which have an address, and the previous create person VM for the first name, the last name, and the age. Now that should be required, but I forgot or I didn't know, so it's not in our example. And now that validate complex type, it's required for the built-in validation to validate the child object. By default, Blazor won't validate that create person VM, even if it has validation attributes. It needs that validate complex type to actually do that. And also in the page that create house page, we need to have not the data notation validator that we had in that create person, which was a simple model, but the object graph data notation validator for objects that have child object. That object graph data notation validator and the validate complex type attribute come from a nugget package called Microsoft ASP.NET Components Data Notations Validation, and it's actually a pre-release. So if you don't have enabled the pre-release checkbox, you won't be able to see it. Anyway, let's go to the back of our page. It's the exact same logic as our previous page, but now the thing is that display errors on our server validator won't work, and let's see why. Now in the display errors we get the model and we pass the property name and the errors. Okay, let's clear the tabs and let's go to our create house VM, I'm sorry. Okay, if the property is the address, it won't be any problem. It will say that it will take the model and it will say that in the create house VM we have some errors to display for the address property. But now what about if it's the first name or the last name of the create person VM? That won't work because the model that it will take, it will be the create house VM, and the create house VM does not have a property of first name or last name or age. So let's try to manipulate all that so that it can actually work. Okay, first of all, as we saw, the model maybe is not the model for the edit context, but a child model. So let's create a method. It will return an object, and let's call that get child model, or just get model, because maybe it's not the child object. Okay, and we need to pass the property so we can find the model by the property. Okay, let's take the model, the root model. It's the current edit context dot get dot model. Okay, and now we need to see if that model has a property like that. with that name. So let's say var property info equals model dot get type dot get runtime property time get runtime property. Okay, and let's pass the name of the property. Now if that property is not null, that means that our parent object, the root object, has a property with that name. So in that case we need just to return the model. So if property info is not null, then just return the model. Okay, now in case it is null, that means that that property, it's not in the parent object, but it's somewhere in the child object. So let's take the properties of the parent model that have that validate complex attribute. So in that example, if we don't find the first name in here, we will try to see what the child objects are, and we know that all the child object had that validate complex type attribute. Okay, let's show that properties. Let's call the properties info. Properties, I mean in our case the create person VM, since it is a property of the create house VM. Okay, in our model we need to get the type, and then we need to get properties, but we need the properties that they have that attribute. So we need to say where they get custom attributes, and what the attributes do we want? The ones that they are of validate complex type attributes. So type of validate complex type attribute. Alright, okay, and now if we stick to our example, in the runtime we should have that create that person VM. Okay, and now maybe in our example we have only one child object, but that server validator won't work for multiple ones. So we need to say that for each property in properties info. Alright, the child object is object equals property dot get value, and let's pass the model. Okay, so we will take that person VM. Okay, now we need to check if that child object has the attribute with that property name. So let's make another helper method, private static bool. Let's call that get if model has property. Okay, and let's pass the object and the property name. Okay, so the property info will be model get type, and then let's try to take that runtime property with that property name. Okay, and now if let's fix the typo. Okay, and now if that the property info is null, that means that that object does not have a property with that name. So if property info is null, return false, or else return null. Okay, excuse me, and let's take the writer suggestion to simplify that. Okay, so now that child object can be null, so if child object is null, let's just return the parent model. Okay, and now if that child object is not null and it has a property with the name that we passed, so if has get if model has property, and let's parse the child object and the property name, then return the child object. Okay, and let's just return in here the parent model. Our code will go here if we don't find any property with a validation complex type attribute, and that we need to close that parenthesis. Okay, and let's fix that. Alright, so back to our display errors. Let's get the model in here. So our model equals with get model, and let's pass the property name. So it will be the error dot key. Okay, and in here we need the model. Okay, let's put a semicolon in there, and now that should work. We will stick a breakpoint, of course, to understand it better. Okay, let's debug this. Let's go to our create house. We'll leave the address empty. We'll put the first name, the last name, and we'll leave the age 0, which will not correct, and that will get us a validation error back. Okay, let's hit create. Alright, now the errors are two, as you can see. The first one is for the address and the second one for the age. Okay, so let's go to our get model. Okay, excellent. The property name is address. We will take the current model, which is the create house VM, and now we will try to see if that create house VM has a property name address. Okay, actually it will have, so we will return the parent model. Let's go in there. Okay, so as you can see, the model is the create house VM, the property is the address, and the error will be the address must not be empty. Okay, now we will go there again for the second property, which is the age. Okay, the model is the create house VM, as you can see. The create house VM does not have a property name age, so that property info will be null. And now we'll try to take all the property infos that are decorated with that validation complex attribute. Let's see what do we have here. We have actually a property that with that attribute, and that, as you can see, is the create person person VM. So let's go for each to our properties, one in our case. Let's continue. Then we'll try to take the child object. In our case, it exists and is that create person VM. So we will go to that get if model has property. Let's go in there. Continue. We'll try. Now we have our model, which is the create person VM, and the property name is the age. So we'll try to see if that create person VM has a property with the name age. Actually, as you can see, it has, it's integer, so we will return true, and because we will return true, we will return that child object. So let's go back in there, let's continue, and now our model is that create person VM, not the create house VM now, and it has an age of 0, a first name and a last name. So we will say that we need to add the new error in that model, and in which property, the age property, and what will be the error, the age must be greater than 0. So if I resume it, we'll have our errors here. Let's see that again. Let's put some random input so we have a clear page. Okay, and now let's try that again. And as you can see, address must not be empty and age must be greater than 0. Okay, that will work with multiple child objects, although if some of them both have a property with the same name, that could be a little tricky. But anyway, you get the point and how you can make that work. So thanks for watching and have a nice one.